Thank you, Peter. Please prepare your questions on that. Our second speaker, Brian McAvera, as you can see from your pack, has got a wide range of interests and skills. As a playwright, he writes books of history and of art criticism, and he also works as a curator. In all those things, he uses language, and he's going to use language now in talking to us about the subject. Where is British art? Brian.
I'm going to ignore this. Hi guys. You heard of a movie called Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead? Any of you? Okay, well, my talk is Things to Do in London When You're at the Tate to discuss. Subtitled because I'm Northern Irish, and thus, incidentally, British. An interrogation, a gentle interrogation in 8 bites. Okay. Bite 1, spin. Museums, publicly funded museums, publicly funded galleries, and critics for that matter, thank you for the lights, used to be in the business of telling it like it is, or what the playwright John Orden, or for that matter, the novelist D.H. Lawrence, would have called telling a tale true. Nowadays, museums and publicly funded galleries and critics behave rather like politicians. Spin doctoring's the order of the day. I'll give you an Irish example. When Declan McGonigal became the first director of the Irish Museum of Modern Art, this is back in 1990, he took over a building called Kilmainham Hospital, an 18th century building. Now, this building was widely acknowledged as being entirely unsuitable for use as a museum, simply because it consisted of very long, narrow corridors with lots of small rooms off. The obvious point, if you're going to show 20th century art, was you can't actually show big works and get away from them so that you can actually see them clearly. Declan went on a publicity blitz, and what he said was, this is the best possible building for a contemporary museum of modern art, precisely because it's got small rooms and none of the rest of you do. Black is turned into white, but Declan, of course, comes from a political family. One order of the day. Second order of the day, still spin. Artists spin. Nowadays, artists have the power to spin, and museums, by and large, comply meekly. Let me take the late Richard Hamilton and the messianic Mr. Anthony Gormley. Mr. Gormley placed one of his sculptures, rather tidily, on Derry's walls, overlooking on one side the Catholic community and on the other side the Protestant community. Now, either not being very bright, or alternatively, not giving two shits, and I'll leave it to you to decide which might be the appropriate response, he declared that his work was about healing the divisions in my benighted land. Now, it didn't seem to occur to him, strangely, that if you have a very tall figure whose face is effectively a balaclava mask, blank eyes, just the mouth, nothing else, and this figure is overlooking the Protestant community as well as the Catholic community, that the Protestant community might just think that this balaclava image is the image of the classic provo or provisional IRA saying, yoo-hoo, we rule over you lot. What happened? The local Protestant community certainly felt that Mr. Gormley was wrong. They took tires and they draped these tires over Mr. Gormley's half-ton sculpture. They then poured petrol over it. They then set it on fire. Now, as I remarked at the time, and actually I remarked at length at the time, in both Art Monthly and later in an American magazine on public art called Stroll, short of an RGP-7 rocket, there was no way that you could actually move Mr. Gormley's piece. But what did Mr. Gormley think about all this? Flash forward. 3-4 years later, ICA conference. Mr. Gormley is giving a speech. He gives a speech in which he tells us about the healing power of the work that he had on Derry's walls. Oddly enough, I happened to be in the audience. I politely informed Mr. Gormley that that might be what he thought. But if the audience that he thought he was healing was actually putting tires, setting them on fire, then quite clearly his work was not about healing two communities. I was informed that I was, despite the fact that I'd actually seen all this with my own eyes, that I was wrong. Flash forward, Tate catalogue, enormous bibliography, all references, not just by me in Art Monthly and Stroll, but everyone else who'd written about this in Ireland, are edited out of the catalogue. Once upon a time, museums actually put in dissenting viewpoints, not necessarily now. Richard Hamilton. Richard Hamilton, we are routinely informed, it's in all of the so-called history books, is a political artist, particularly in relation to Northern Ireland. Now, if you remember the time of the hunger strikes, time of the citizen, the image that is produced, guy, long hair, looking remarkably like the classic Catholic image of Christ that you'll find in any Irish household. And of course, the rest of the image is the shit-smeared cells that the hunger strikers were in. This image is being promoted as a political image in relation to Northern Ireland. I interviewed Mr. Hamilton, and first of all, I made reference to the work that everybody knows, the Kent State University shootings, about which he made a number of images, and which have, retrospectively, been called serious political images. And I asked him directly, I said, did you have any political intent at all when you were making those works? And he said, and I quote, no. He said, the only thing I was interested in was the formal aspects of the photographs that I looked at. This is not what we read nowadays. I then asked him about the image that he produced of the citizen, pointing out the Provo lineage. He disclaimed all knowledge of it. Now, Mr. Hamilton was an extremely intelligent man. I find it very difficult to believe that an extremely intelligent man in Northern Ireland could be utterly incapable of seeing what is a very obvious lineage. Of course, he may not have wanted to. But again, I asked him the question, and I said, did you have any political intent in relation to this image? And again, the response was no. Flash forward today, actually only a month ago. There's an exhibition, of all places, Municipal Gallery in Dublin. All of these images are there. It is now claimed that, in actual fact, Mr. Hamilton was making very substantial political statements about the state of Northern Ireland. Much to my amusement, our American critic Hal Foster wrote to this effect in London Review of Books. Now, I get really pissed off writing letters which continually reinvent the wheel, but for once I actually wrote in pointing out that there's very clear evidence that he's absolutely and totally wrong. One small, tiny note, because it really gets on my goat. A very large number of not just English, but European and American artists flew into Northern Ireland for the quick incursion, usually about 4 days, into the war zone. Actually, they flew into very nice hotels and were shepherded around everywhere, but let's not worry about that. On the basis of this quick incursion, they produce a work which they say is about the Troubles. Now, the Tate collected Mr. Hamilton, and Mr. Gormley in relation to the North, and quite a few other people. What they didn't collect was a single solitary artist who was from Northern Ireland. The images you're seeing as I talk are from 3 artists, Jack Pakenham, Una Walker, Jerry Gleeson, roughly 25 images each, all of whom have spent over 30 years making socio-political art. You'll not find any of them. You might ask why. A step further, 4 in terms of collecting policy. And in the following, if you're from Wales, Scotland, or for that matter, anywhere north of Watford, you can actually almost interchangeably put those places for me when I talk about Ireland. Academic, scholar, called Fintan Cullen. He's an authority in 18th century art, and in particular 18th century Irish art. And he wrote an article, Who Owns Irish Art? And he discussed what happened when the V&A decided that they wanted to get an export license to stop the Getty in the States acquiring a pastel by a guy called Hamilton, 18th century, and it was called Antonio Canova in his studio with Henry Tresham and a plaster model for the Cupid and Psyche. And Cullen, our art historian, was the independent assessor for this. Now, this deferral was requested despite the fact that the pastel in question was produced in Rome by an Irish artist, portrays an Italian sculptor, and another Irish painter. And to acquire this particular work, the V&A proceeded to edit out every single Irish reference. Tellingly, politically, they won the referral. The press release did not mention that Hamilton was Irish, did not mention that he was a leading 18th century Irish artist, did not mention that he had a well-documented relationship with Canova, but did mention that he had a relationship with a number of British patrons. The report which was issued didn't mention any of that either. As Cullen remarked, if you were cynical, and of course one wouldn't be that, you might surmise that when a work is of high aesthetic value, it is categorized as British, but if they don't consider it to be of high aesthetic value, well then, the Irish can have it. This is called cultural appropriation. Take a look at the majority of exhibitions which claim to be British, particularly group exhibitions, and count the number of Scottish, Northern Irish, or Welsh artists in them, particularly in the period before 2000. Bite 5. British Council and Northern Ireland. This bit's quite entertaining for me. For much of the Troubles, Dr. S.B. Kennedy, he's the author of Irish Art and Modernism, which is the first major monograph of its kind, was Keeper of Art at the Ulster Museum. Now, in conversation with him, and probably somewhat stupidly, I remarked that I was rather surprised that the museum didn't take exhibitions from the British Council, and also that they never seemed to avail themselves of the opportunity of actually getting an exhibition of Northern Irish art to the British Council so that the British Council could promote it. Do you know what he said? He said, number one, they've been trying for the previous 15 years to get the British Council to send them an exhibition, and the British Council refused. And he said, B, British Council weren't remotely interested in promoting Northern Irish art. End of that particular story. Personal note, jump forward 5 years, roughly year 2000. I go to the then head of the British Council in Belfast with the suggestion that we might curate an exhibition of Northern Irish art and so promote it, especially post-1994 and all of that. He laughed. And he said, Brian, do you know what the total budget I have across all of the arts is for a year? I said, no. He said, £8,000. And then he said, London wouldn't be interested anyway. Things change, but not that much. Bite 6. Royal Academy. Strange thing about the Royal Academy, you will remember there was a sculpture exhibition earlier on this year. It was actually curated by our new current director at the Tate here. It received, I think I can fairly say, the worst reviews that I have read in a very, very long time. And I was initially baffled because I went to the exhibition and I thought, thank God, an exhibition that actually has some kind of intelligence for once. It was an exhibition which was actually comparing and contrasting work from other periods and other eras with contemporary work. But there was one very noticeable omission, and I wrote her a letter, and I said something along the lines of, really loved the exhibition, thought you were really unfairly criticized because you were trying to do something different, but wasn't it rather noticeable that the only Irish person you had in was that honorary Londoner F.E. McWilliam, and that by and large, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, even Pavlozzi wasn't in it, weren't there. She wrote me a very nice letter back, explaining, as I already knew, that she was well aware of all of these omissions, but saying that she wasn't allowed to put them in. Now, think for a second. If the head of an institution like this can't persuade the establishment, what possible chance have people like us? There are vested interests, and there are vested interests. Next, back to collections. You've got by implication that I consider that the Tate aren't particularly interested in collecting either Troubles art from Northern Ireland, or for that matter, any other art from Northern Ireland. Now, if I was going to be political, I'd say this is a legacy of colonial attitudes. Those of you who know a bit about Irish history will know all about 1801 and the Act of Union, which a number of historians have suggested effectively neutered Ireland. And it effectively neutered Ireland because what it meant was that London took all of the decisions, that to ratify anything, even art, you had to go to London. Now, we have, still to today, this sense that if an Irish artist hasn't got a London gallery, then the Irish artist hasn't made it. Same artist might have shown in New York or wherever, but if they haven't made it in London, they are not seen as having made it. But rather more important than that is the kind of colonial or colonialized mindset that was actually imprinted on the institutions in Ireland. Just to take Northern Ireland, I'm talking quite specifically about the Ulster Museum and the Arts Council of Northern Ireland. So, for example, if you look at the collection of Northern Irish art in the Ulster Museum, what is striking is how little they have of it. Now, they do have work by Lavery, that glorious Glasgow boy ratified by London. They do have work by the previously mentioned F.E. McWilliam, who spent most of his life living in London, and they do have work by William Scott, who of course spent a hell of a lot of time in London. But if you take the broad sweep of Northern Irish art, particularly in the 20th century, as documented in, say, Art in Ulster I and Art in Ulster II, you'll maybe find about 10% of it, if that, in the Ulster Museum collection, and you'll find none of the Troubles artists. There are about 10 major artists who actually developed socio-political art during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, about another 40 who did so at intervals. You will not find them in the collections. Now, joke from my point of view. Arts Council of Northern Ireland decided a few years back, dearie me, the world has been saying, isn't the Troubles a major thing in terms of we've got umpteen million books and academics exploring the geography, exploring the history, exploring the religion, exploring the sociology, exploring the politics. There are more books published in Northern Ireland within this past 35 years than you could put into an entire bookshop. But you will not find any on Northern Irish art, which is very interesting. But first of all, let me come back to the joke. The Arts Council decided we need a Troubles archive. Hands up. What do you think they put in it? Anybody? Okay, ask you a question. Did they buy any work, Troubles work, by Northern Irish artists who had produced socio-political work? What do you think? Do you think then when they decided that they're going to have a Troubles archive that they then went out to remedy that and bought any? No. What they did do, and you can go now to the Ulster Museum today, and you will see this Troubles archive, and it consists largely of a very large number of panels detailing what the BBC did in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. Guess who wrote it, presented it, and made it? Anybody? The BBC. Now, we all know that the BBC is a bastion of accuracy and a stickler for actually looking at the arts produced in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, don't we? I mean, it beggars belief that this could happen, but that's what we get. Oddly enough, back in 1985, I think it was the first time I pointed out in an English magazine, Art Monthly, yet again, as it happens, that the Northern Irish Arts Council wasn't collecting political art. And I made a reference to the fact that one of their printmakers, that they had 26 works by this printmaker. And in relation to Troubles artists, they had one work by a guy, Jack Pakenham, who was a socio-political artist, but it wasn't actually a socio-political work. You will not be surprised to learn that there was a letter in the next issue, which took me to task, pointing out that I was completely wrong. They did not have 26 works by this printmaker. They had 25. Art Monthly ran the heading, printmaker 25, Pakenham nil. And the joke was, I had taken the original figures from their own list. I'm just going to. So, the conclusion, and I'll not bore you with an analysis of the relationship between collecting policies in Northern Ireland and the ones over here, is to say that if you look at the Weimar Republic, or if you look at the Mexican Civil War, the images that come to your head are of the artists during those eras. Now, doesn't common sense tell you that when there are a very large number of Northern Irish artists who have borne witness for the best part of 30 years, that at the absolute least, that work will be of historical value? So ask yourselves, how come Tate don't think so, Ulster Museum don't think so, Arts Council of Northern Ireland don't think so. Irish Museum of Modern Art don't think so. I'll give you one simple answer to that. If you have work produced by someone outside, it's deracinated. And if it's simple and easy and can be reduced to, in effect, an advertising logo, isn't it much easier to handle? You don't actually have to do any real work to explore it. That's the legacy where I come from. All of the interesting stuff gets edited out of art history, and we are left with what is, in effect, a colonial palimpsest. Thank you.